welcome to the latest episode of Call to the Bar, International Law Over Drinks. I'm your host, Dr. Tamsin Phillipa Paige, Associate Professor at Deakin Law School. Today we are discussing global governance in honour of the publication of the excellent Research Handbook on Global Governance. I am joined by the editors of this amazing compilation, Dr. Cher Weixia Chen, Associate Professor at the School of Integrative Studies at George Mason University, Dr. Ruth Houghton, Senior Lecturer at Newcastle Law School, and Professor Aoife O'Donoghue, Professor at Queen's University Belfast. Before we begin, I remind everyone that these informal conversations, we are as always speaking off the cuff and without the benefit of footnotes, and nothing we say should be taken to have been thoroughly peer reviewed. And before we get down to business, our traditional first question, Cher, Aoife, Ruth, what's your drink?
Well, I'm starting off with coffee, Tamsin. Thanks ever so much for having us on the podcast. I'm going to need the caffeine to keep up with the conversation as we go through the podcast today and the rest of my term, in which I'm launching the Global Law LLB degree here in Newcastle. So, coffee it is for me this morning.
That sounds like a very good choice with all of that going on. Aoife, what have you got for us?
So I have, I think the same as I had the last time, which is my traditional cup of Barry's tea, which I consume a huge amount every day. And to add to it, I am drinking it out, and you can't see this, but I'm drinking it out of a cork mug. So Barry's tea in a cork mug, just to emphasize the importance of my own personal locality, where I'm from, and how Barry's tea is the best tea in the whole world.
And Cher?
Yeah, I'm having a good old just warm water. But I'm always just dreaming of some sparkling tropical mocktail. I mentioned to you maybe lots of pineapples and mangoes, and it makes me think of a beach, probably where you are, and then this will feel, especially nice because it's so cold here, and then I'm a bit jealous because it's summertime in Australia. So just good warm hot water here.
Look, that sounds completely reasonable. And it's the middle of a heat wave here in Australia on the East Coast. So it's over 30 degrees at 10 o'clock at night when we're recording this. So I have a sparkling mineral water with a twist of blood orange and mango, but I also have some tea, which is, I've had it before and it always amazes me, this tea. It's a butterfly mango dragon fruit white tea. Um, but particularly the butterfly pea flowers in this make it blue. So my tea is blue, and that's really cool. It makes me very happy. I can't find a way to show it to you. Maybe I can. There we go. Yes.
Is
That
See,
is
yeah,
blue.
it's blue. Wow,
ocean.
it's very Star Wars of you there.
Yeah, yeah.
But
Blue tea. I
yeah.
kind of love it. So yeah, blue tea. But moving on. Now, two of you have not been on the pod before, and we usually start by asking our new guests, how did you get into international law? What career path brought you to your present job? Now, Aoife, you've done this before when we spoke in season one on the UN Security Council, so you get a pass. So, but this question is for both Cher and Ruth.
So maybe I should start first. Yeah, and I see myself first and foremost as an international human rights law scholar. So, how did it start? Back in 2006, I was interning in a legal department of International Labor Organization in Geneva. And you probably remember that same summer, the UN created the Human Rights Council, and I had the chance to be smuggled into its very first meeting in July. And I will never, never forget it because it was so overwhelming. So many countries, so many issues. But what struck me most is the energy in the room, the passion people brought to human rights, and it was unlike anything I had seen before. And what moved me most was how much people care about their own community, also how much they care about communities halfway across the world. And for me, that was humanity at its finest, so beautiful, so powerful. And it was a defining and enlightening moment to me, both personally and professionally.
That's a really beautiful story, and I'm kind of jealous that I have never gotten to experience that sort of a moment in international law because that sounds beautiful.
Yeah, there is how human rights law became my thing. So a defining moment, a defining moment.
Oh, fantastic. Ruth?
Oh, mine is such a more windy and kind of digression path than that. I came to international law having started my academic studies in English and history. But I've always had this kind of caustic concern with what we might want to call democratization. You know, whose opinions mattered in literature? Who defined literature? Whose history were we really concerned with? That's, as a student, what kind of drove me. I then went to law school at the University of Birmingham, where in a moment of what can only be described as a baptism of fire, I signed up to be in the competition to be part of the Jessup Moot team. For those that aren't familiar, that is the international law moot, having never studied international law at all. And if there was a defining moment, which is not as beautiful as Cher's, it's when I was printing off hundreds of pages of French international law judgments in my dining room with my dad standing there thinking, what are you doing? So preparing for this competition, Dad. Yeah, but this is in French. I know, I don't know what's happened as I tried to navigate international law judgments for the first time. But, you know, after having done the kind of prep for that moot, I still was left with these questions about democracy, concerns about democracy and international decision making that led me into my PhD under Aoife's supervision at Durham, where I was introduced to global constitutionalism. And it's global constitutionalism or questions about democracy, constituent power, and constitutionalism that drive me now as I sit here in Newcastle.
And fantastic. And working with two of my dear friends in Gina Heathcote and Emily Jones,
That's
who are
right.
also
Yeah.
friends of the podcast. And it's a whole litany of connections because Aoife, you used to work with one of my current PhDs, Holly Cullen, who
Yeah,
is, as I
absolutely.
said, supervising the PhD of someone who's already a professor is like the easiest supervision I'm ever going to get in my career.
And Holly is so lovely as well. She was
Oh,
very
she's a delight.
when I joined Durham, and she was always so kind and
Yeah.
welcoming and friendly and such great with advice when I
Yeah.
started off. So yeah,
Yeah,
she was great.
she's a wonderful person. I'm very pleased to have her both as a PhD but also as a friend and colleague. So I agree with that.
And
Um,
we should definitely give out a Durham Law shout out to Dina Trusvala, who's one of
Yeah,
the podcast
yeah.
editors as well.
this is I forgot that Dina went to Durham. There we
Yeah,
go.
Oh, wow.
yeah. We
Very
she co-ran Law and Global Justice, I think, with me for a while. I'm trying to remember back in the various ways we all ran it, Ruth, but she was, yeah, yep.
There you go. International law is a very small world.
Yeah, indeed.
We'll get on to the main event here and global governance. So, in the preface for the book, you highlight the litany of global problems the world is facing. So, climate change, pandemics, and vast inequalities are among the list. You also note that this is currently occurring against a backdrop of far-right nationalist and anti-collective movements. So, what do we mean when we talk about global governance and why does it matter?
I'll kick off, I suppose, because I wrote the chapter that said why bother, and which I suppose in some ways goes to it. And I think in lots of ways, I suppose it's always been a frustration of mine since I started, because like when I started, it was very much in vogue. It was still in the kind of like everything is going to be great era. It was when I was doing my master's, the second Iraq war happened, and I always think that is kind of like if you think about pivotal moments, kind of a moment which changed things. Because I think why bother in the sense that it global governance was and it was interesting doing the research about the phrase, and that it really was something that, well, it's been around for 150 years, or have you, it really was in the 80s and the 90s that it took off as a way to reframe what was already going on. Like what I found really interesting about it really wasn't that there was no new phenomenon that they were describing at all, especially in international legal terms, that it was describing what was always going on, but kind of quoting it in a positive way, and a way that sort of masked all the harms it was producing, because it's sort of using words like governance and global, which is a big thing for Ruth, about what do we mean by global, but kind of masking all the harms. Because for me, when people go, rightfully critiquing, like, you shouldn't do global governance, going like, well, that doesn't stop it happening. The fact that all the very, very justifiable critique which is throughout the book about the way the system functions and operates doesn't mean that we shouldn't engage in the term or how it's used. And I think that's even more relevant as international law is increasingly collapsing around us. Though I keep making the point that like 70% of it is working fine all the time. This is how we're all in, 3 different countries in the world having this conversation, is partly based on international law, right? But
aren't we in 4 different countries?
Three.
Northern Ireland and England aren't different countries?
That's why I said 3.
Well, we've got Australia, Northern Ireland, England, and aren't you in the US? Isn't that 4?
So Australia, the UK, and the US, that's 3.
Okay, I was treating the Northern Ireland and England as separate countries.
They are 2 different nations. But I mean, if you want me to get into the constitutional question, let's like different podcasts.
I think that's time for a different podcast. I am mistaken here. There we go.
Technically, from an international perspective, yeah. I mean, it's very obviously Northern Ireland is very complicated sovereignty and constitutional structures and stuff. Total other podcast. So I think with the why bother came because when we were asked, I thought it was interesting when we were initially approached, because I was like, I'm not very the obvious person here to do this at all. But in lots of ways, I think because I'm very insistent on looking at things like economic law, for instance, to understand how the world works, that the critique is right, but you have to actually engage with how the people who think it's great talk about it and use it and frame it. In lots of ways to understand why their project has completely fallen apart in and of itself, but also to bring in all those voices that normally don't get in from often the people who are being very positive about it, which I think is kind of slightly the ironic thing about the way that a lot of global governance happens, even though I don't think it's no longer trendy in any sense of the word now, I think, from any corner. And if Ruth or Cher want to.
I think Ruth and Aoife, they are the masterminds behind this project. So Ruth, go ahead.
No, I mean, I think one of the things that in terms of we think about what do we mean when we talk about global governance, Aoife's right there that we, in the book, tried to interrogate both what then was meant by global and what is meant by governance. And what you can't see, listeners, is that I have a little coaster here that says I am a caustic bitch who pulls faces at people who use the word global, because that idea of what do we even mean by the global in global governance kind of drove a lot of the decisions behind this edited collection. Did we mean global as being beyond the state? What about things that are happening and influenced and impacted below the state, in inverted commas? Do we mean the kind of the norms, rules, and practices across and between states? Is there some sort of known level in a scalar model of governance that we call global? Does that somehow sit metaphorically above an international level? Who gets included and who gets excluded, as Aoife mentions already, within the terminology of global? And I guess that driver as to problematizing the use of the word global, as well as the book problematizes ideas of what we might mean by governance, do we just mean the rules and laws and international law being a big part of that? Or do we also mean other norms? The book includes chapters on religion, on gender, on race as norms that govern society and communities under this kind of broadening or problematization of global governance that we wanted the book to do. And I guess that's, in a way, why it mattered. Chapters in this edited collection highlight the number of ways why it matters, the countries, places, people, communities, individuals, and environments that are marginalized, terrorized, harmed, decimated, squashed by decisions that were made within this framework that we call global governance, whether or not that was chapters on international criminal law, human rights law, as Cher had mentioned, international law, or just UN policies and practices. And that might be because it's failures of global governance, or it might, that those very decisions have done the squashing, or it might be that it's a failure of global governance to respond. And I think, the book, for those of you that have seen it, has got a picture of a deflated globe on the front. And so are we in that moment where the language of international law and the language of global cooperation is actually faltering, and that global governance is that deflated beach ball that we have on the front cover, and we should move on. But perhaps that's why now more than ever, we needed to return to the scholarship, to the debates, to the discussions, to the way in which it's been framed, as Aoife says, to figure out what were the limitations of that debate, what went wrong, what might have been done differently, or how can we now do global governance and its scholarship differently.
Just adding as a little side note, because of a comment from Douglas, always look for the Vatican in everything international law. They show up everywhere, and they're showing up in global governance all over again.
They are actually, yeah, in a kind of very obvious way too, which is interesting. I was going to kind of that. Yeah, I think what's interesting, I think, in the way that people, because it can come across where it is a very negative book, and it is because there's a load of harms. But also, I think where there can be, and this is sort of like as a feminist scholar, where you can find hope or love is also in the imaginative ways that people talk about not reform necessarily, but in the way that they talk about each other and the people they're writing about, or the ecologies that they're writing about, or the environment that they're writing about. That there is that sort of kind of going back to Cher's point earlier about humanity, that there's loads of critique, but I think within it there's a kind of an underlying humanity that is built in ideas of hope, which was, I think, in because it took a lot. Some people didn't see themselves as being in global governance, and I think that was one of the issues we had, kind of building on what Ruth said as well. It was kind of pointing out to people that actually, I know you wouldn't be normally in this, but that's why we want you to be in this. This is why we want to talk about religion in a state in sub-Saharan Africa, or about socialism in Belgium, or because that's not normally what's there, and sort of presenting humanity in all its like fantastically, messily, contradictory sort of ways. And I think, and this is only a tiny slither of that, because we certainly didn't achieve all the sort of areas we wanted to cover or the voices we wanted to hear, but that sort of was, I think, an important part of sort of the driver in being editors. Another thing, like in picking the front cover, like that took a bit of time. And also involved having a discussion about, like, we don't want any AI generated images, which also goes back to the AI in the book and the chapter on AI and technology. But that kind of, like wanting the book to picking an image that's somehow tried to communicate what it was we were trying to say.
Yeah, and I think both Aoife and Ruth have laid out the plan behind this beautifully. And I just want to add a couple of points. One is about the governance. So, governance is not just about who governs, right? But also about who is being governed. And crucially, who gets a voice. And so it's, Ruth mentioned, it's about institutions, yes, but it's also about people and communities. And another one of the major motivations behind this project is that we realize, despite how much is written about global governance, it often isn't actually global. And in one of the introductions, it's mentioned that too often it's Western scholars talking to other Western scholars about the rest of the world. And so what this handbook tries to do is to flip the script by centering voices from across regions, disciplines, and lived experiences. And one of the reviewers of the book mentioned, why this matters right now, because we are living in a moment where the problems we face are increasingly global: climate change, right? And the good and the bad of AI. But the political responses are moving in the opposite direction, towards nationalism, towards fragmentation, and going it alone. So the reviewer mentioned that we are facing borderless crises, but retreating into local silos. And that tension is at the heart of the book as well.
Fantastic. You've kind of partially answered the next question already, but I'm going to go with it anyway so you can expand upon those answers. And the book was a mammoth undertaking, and it touches, as you've noted, on a wide variety of theoretical framings and approaches, and as well as topics. It took about 5 years to get through from kind of the invitations through to this final version that we have sitting next to me on my desk. And we saw a few problems with authors. Really sorry. I know I was one of the problems. I'll own that publicly. So sorry about that. But why was this project important enough to pursue through all of those difficulties? And what insights did you gain from that process?
Give a shout out to our publishers as a first thing that were very patient. Like at no point did they at all complain or give out to us about it. And we explained. I mean, some things were fairly obvious, like COVID. But we said to them, if we're doing this, we want to get voices that normally aren't heard. We wanted to be interdisciplinary, so a good number of the chapters are written by lawyers with other disciplines, and like we were saying, that takes more time. And they were always 100% behind that, and behind the fact that we weren't going to give them a traditional handbook in that sense. So I wanted a big shout out to them, because actually, if the corporate world of legal publishing wasn't willing to give us the time and space, then it really wouldn't have happened. But I think from the very outset, we sort of agreed that if things took time and people needed time, and this was before there was wars when we started, but before the pandemic and before the wars magnified and there was genocide, and that we would take the time that was necessary to get it out with the voices that we wanted to have and the topics that we wanted to have. Now, we didn't get all the topics. We had a blue chapter on the oceans, and that, as anyone who's ever done an out collection, I know, Tamsin, you've done the same. You lose chapters along the way, and sometimes you're able to get other people to do it, and then other times you just have to say no. We had ones on the islands in the Pacific, and we lost that one, and so that it was sort of but still making the time to make sure that we had the voices. And part of this, I think, is a feminist ethic, and one rooted probably in sort of Twale scholarship as well, in that the idea that not everyone has the privilege of being in a Western university with access to library materials in a safe, secure way, where they can be themselves and present to themselves. And not everyone, would say, not everyone at Western universities can do that anymore either. I mean, that's fundamentally changed as well. People who are working in states where it was perfectly fine to do lots of things no longer work in those countries either. But that kind of commitment to time, to patience, to understand that people get ill, that people go through medical things, happen to people. In some place, people were living, wars started for people's families were structured like it's kind of, looking back, it's kind of all the things that happen to people, but that to stay true to that ethic was very, very important to us, and to have the patience. And that included losing editors as well. We lost Shona Wheatle and Yasmin Brunger, who were both involved as editors as well, and understanding that the leadership, it takes time and effort and energy. And we were really lucky that Cher agreed to come in and join us on it. So I think it took the time partly because we chose to take the time, because that's what the ethic of the book was about. But it also took the time because a lot of really horrible things happened, and horrible things are happening all the time. But I mean, the people writing in pandemics and in wars and in climate catastrophes. I mean, as you said at the very beginning, Tamsin, right? You're sitting there in 31 degrees at 10 o'clock at night, and there's going to be a windstorm tomorrow. Like that, people were living through these experiences, and that we kind of felt that if it's a book about global governance, and we mean it to be actually about that, then we had to take the time. And I think probably it would be a quite different book if we had done it fast. I mean, and I think that's not to say things that come out quickly are bad. That's not what I'm saying at all. I think there can be, there are reasons for every approach that is appropriate to the project that you wanted to complete. And the project that we were trying to complete, that was sort of, that was, there was more things. It's also 5 years, so I'm trying to remember all the things that we were.
I think if we thinking about then the insights that we gained from that, how do you actually do a global edited collection that is, we had these principles at the start about diversity and inclusion. How do you find people to write chapters? How do you circulate a call for papers? I mean, the entire way in which academia would do that now here in 2026 is completely different to how we were then trying to circulate those call for papers in 2019, building on our own networks that were narrow and confined to a very a specific world within international law, trying to kind of break out into this kind of interdisciplinary space and spaces that we didn't know. Tamsin quite rightly has just flagged RIP Twitter, because that is what we did. That's where we put these shouts out, and and that wasn't enough. That is what we learned. We had limited networks. We were drawing on a limited small group, a bubble, if you like, even within that kind of academic world of Twitter. And I think one of the things we learned was, as Aoife has already flagged, the institutional resources in kind of academic websites, the way in which people profiles are presented across the world are very, very different. There's often no email address attached to people, or no list of up-to-date publications, because of the different ways in which institutions work. And it's not the same as looking up somebody in the UK and across the board you can work out, there's their email address and there's their list of publications. So trying to find ways of making it inclusive when we were entering a world of the unknown, and not always knowing how to then reach out to people to ask them to be included. And as Aoife kind of flagged, we were then approaching people in different disciplines to say, hey, we're doing this research handbook on global governance. We've read your work. Would you like to do a chapter? And I don't do global governance. Would be like, well, we think you do. So kind of reflecting on how we had defined global governance, or what we thought of global governance was not how other people were defining it, or the disciplines were defining it. We needed to really break open the terminology and the invitation to bring in that diversity of disciplinary and diversity of disciplines that we wanted to include, and to bring into conversation with the law scholarship. Another insight that I have is just one of the favorite moments of doing this edited collection, because as we said, it's taken a while. Do you all remember sitting in 2020, kind of different stages of people with COVID in these online workshops that we ran, across different time zones? I think we had 2 different workshops so that we could capture as many time zones as we could. I know I had COVID at the time, transcribing this thing, thinking about how we were going to circulate the findings so that people felt part of a shared project, but nevertheless had to be in these different workshops, so that we could make sure that it had captured as many authors and as many participants in the project as we could. and I think, did we get it right along the way? Not always, but I think one of the things we hope we did, and one of the things that I think is an insight to take away is that idea of transparent communication with everybody that was involved. We knew we wanted to take the time to make sure, and that can be deeply frustrating for those that needed chapters out. They needed those publications. They were waiting years in some instances, but open and transparent communication as editors to our authors about those processes and the changes in the timelines, being clear about we would wait. The world doesn't wait for academic chapters, but we could slowly, we could slow down, we could delay so that life could happen, so that those important voices and perspective and experiences were part of the discussion.
Yeah, and I have to say big shout out to Eva and Ruth for insisting the collection has to be diverse, has to be interdisciplinary, and has to be global. And I had another collection. I was editing that collection and trying to be global, trying to have representation from around the world, but it's so hard. And in the end, we lost colleagues to to pandemic, to everything else, and then we have some cars from Africa, and you couldn't even imagine. I mean, the electricity there is rationed. So how to communicate? How to have a meeting? And in the end, we lost her. It's just it's hard to keep the balance between having the collection done in a timely manner and then trying to make it as global, as diverse, as interdisciplinary as possible. And so it's a hard balance, but I admire Ruth and Eva a lot for insisting this has to be done in this way. And so thank you.
Yeah, and look, I can definitely say I have been part of projects that have been very quick, and some that have been t very long. The queer encounters and queer engagements books were very quick. We did that in like 2 years. And so it does, as you said, quick isn't necessarily bad because you can get some great stuff, but it does lead to a very different experience of editing, I would say. So you've gone through, we have this huge book. I'm just checking, it's like 600 pages. It's fantastic. What particular chapters stand out for each of you? This is not saying favorite chapters, but what stands outest in the chapters for each of you, and why? Why does that chapter or those chapters stand out for you?
Well, there's a great chapter that uses Star Trek that I'd like to highlight.
I think, Tamsin, you should talk about your chapter at
Yeah,
this point. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, I can do that. So I have a chapter in there that marries my love of science fiction with looking at questions of utopianism and dystopianism in global governance. And so I wrote it with one of my other PhD students, Joanne Stagg, who is phenomenal scholar, who I have dragged into international law. She's a feminist and queer theory scholar and law and lit scholar who I've dragged slowly, kicking and screaming, into international law with the promise of cookies. So we got together and we wrote this chapter on utopian and dystopian democracy and utopian and dystopian fascism. And so for utopian democracy, we've looked at Star Trek original series and Next Generation and the utopianism that comes with that explicitly democratic interstellar society rather than global, but same framework. And then we looked at how that turns in Picard into a dystopian democracy of the same scale through the failure to continue to commit to the process of utopia. Um, and that's the big thing we kind of came to, is that utopia is not an endpoint or a destination. It's a process that you need to have this ongoing commitment to. Otherwise, it does all, in fact, fall apart. For when we contrasted those things to the governance we see in the European Union and the ideals, the utopian ideals that come with the EU, like there's explicit. It's not even kind of an implicit utopian set of ideals. It's explicit in so much EU um, public-facing media. And then we looked at the reality of how that then, in times of crisis, has actually been abandoned as process of utopia and become quite a dystopian experience of democracy for a number of people, particularly as you get further to the margins of the EU's power structures. And so we kind of were able to look at this and say, actually, these utopian and dystopian governance comparators do exist in real life, and it kind of depends a lot on where you sit as to how you experience them. We then, for fascism, we looked at one of my all-time favorite films, which is, to be fair, a satire of fascism, but not for the characters in the movie, which is Starship Troopers. And it's absolutely satire. We all know it's satire, although people didn't work it out for about 10 years after it was released that it was satire, because the characters are playing it straight. They're buying into the internal propaganda of the fascist society. And so utopian fascism, it is promising a better world with stars and glory and shiny things, and everyone is buying into this militaristic death meat grinder for the better world. And for dystopian fascism, we actually looked at the 2012 iteration of Dredd. Um, and so Judge Dredd, that's been, comics and few iterations. We looked at the 2012 version, mostly because as a gay woman, Lena Headey as Mama is just like crack. Um, but um, moving on from that, we kind of look at how when you don't have this utopian unanimous working together towards the fascist goals, what you end up having is unaccountable power terrorizing society. And so we contrasted that to the UN. And the UN, particularly because of the structure of the Security Council and the veto, placing the P5 above the law in order on the promise of them guaranteeing peace for the world through strength and might. And the trade-off for that is them being unaccountable, and how that has very quickly gone away from those ideals into what I recently described in an op-ed as evil and villainous behavior, evil and villainy.
Yeah.
I think I described it as hypocrisy and villainy in the op-ed, and in a tweet on Blue Sky, I described it as evil and villainous. Same deal, but looking at how that has become a governance structure that the world is trying to endure and survive, rather than it being something for the goodness of the world. So that's kind of the chapter that I wrote with Joanne. I think it's pretty good. I think that I stand by my conclusions after working with UN material for 12, 13 years that, yeah, fascism is kind of where we are with it. That's going to upset a few people, but I stand by that.
And it's a great chapter, not simply because like you did all the things that I love in it, but I think it's like I think what was really interesting about your chapter too, and Lee Kagan's chapter, is that showing the sort of variety that there is in looking to like popular fiction or not so popular fiction, in teasing those things out and reflecting, as the best of those things do, reflecting it back to us. And I think it's only become more relevant actually as the time, as several of the chapters have. It's only become much more apparent, I think, how important your book is, or your chapter is.
Yeah. That is one of my favorite chapters too, I have to say. And another chapter that I personally found especially powerful is the one on disability rights, chapter 14 by Delia, Andrea, and Anne. And so that chapter looks at how disability rights have evolved globally, particularly through the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And what I appreciate is that it doesn't treat disability as a single isolated issue. Instead, it shows how complex and layered the global governance of a disability rights really is. I mean, legally, politically, and institutionally. So the chapter also highlights the growing role of civil society in pushing disability rights forward, and it takes an explicitly intersectional approach. In particular, it draws attention to the intersection between disability and age, something that is still surprisingly under-examined, even though aging and disability often overlap with each other in a very real ways. So what struck me most is that it's a group that has historically been deeply marginalized, and yet the theoretical work around disability rights by the activists, by the institutions, is actually some of the most innovative and progressive in global governance today. And that contrast really stayed with me. So another one of my favorite chapters, in addition to Tamsin's.
I jump in next. So I mean, again, it's like very hard to pick what you're going to talk about, but I think I want to. One I'm going to focus on is Olivia Woolley's chapter. Olivia actually worked with in Durham for a few years. She's great. She's a great colleague. So she looked at like Earth planetary systems. And what I really liked about it in the context of the whole collection was how she picked out where the planetary system, which is very global governance-esque, that we need to go to the global regulatory level in order to, resolve the climate catastrophe. And so there's the arguments, that we need to global, climate needs to be done on a global level, the legal system needs to be done on a global level, and it's only then that we can, and in much further than a traditional treaty way of understanding it, like that embedding the actual governance into it, which I don't do in international environmental law, so a lot of that was new to me. But what I really liked was her critique of that, and her, because I think in the context of what the editor collection was trying to do, it's a really brilliant example of what's lost when you look. So she talks about how sort of the unknowability, which I really liked, that she highlighted the unknowability of how global systems work, that at the local level, things are unknowable about the ecology of the system and how all the different elements interact, including the human. Because of course, obviously, like post-humanism and the environment, but sure, like humanity is there, and we can't ignore that humanity is there, and the levels of unknowability that produces, and how much that unknowability gets multiplied when we go to a planetary system. That we all know all the critiques about global governance being, at this hyperscale level. So that's again, Ruth's topic, but that how much that even at the very local, regional level, there is so much unknowability. But embracing that unknowability, like seeing that as a way of understanding how law can, in fact, go about it, but understanding. And lots of ways, that's where law is good, right? Indeterminacy. If we all accept that law is indeterminate in the first place, then, which obviously not everybody does. To shout out to all the analytical jurisprudence people in Oxford and Cambridge. Sorry, I shouldn't pick on them, but but that's sort of that. If we embrace that and understand that we will in fact be better at dealing with the global climate catastrophe than we are in going to that planetary system, that it has a place, but it's definitely not the answer, and that it will. And I also like she really highlights how that will just replicate all of the ways that things haven't worked before. That we're going with a system that hasn't worked, and we're planetary system sort of approaches double down on that. And like embracing either the language of ecology in the way that she does that, sort of about like ecology and sort of this is kind of people do theory that kind of use like rhizomes and those sort of where people like using the mycelial network of mushrooms at the moment. So that is becoming an area I think that's getting more attention, but using that language of ecology to understand law, not in that theoretical way, but of how all the interactions work. and that you can never just look at one thing, that you have to look at the whole system. And and terrible, Donald Rumsfeld's unknown unknowns, that, it was in the context of a terrible global governance situation, but that unknown unknowns being of value and of worth, and not something necessarily to fear, which is how Donald Rumsfeld was using it. But yeah, I just thought the book and lots of the chapter really, in a really interesting way, demonstrated all the themes of the edited collection in sort of one little, sort of, like, not little, it's a very long chapter, but like in really detailed and thoughtful way. But I love Olivia's work anyway, even though it's not an area I know a huge amount about, but she writes so well, I think, and articulates things in such a beautiful manner.
So I'm going to share a little fun fact about these ecological unknowns, which goes to some recent stuff I was reading in random science article. Um, and do you know how there's been mass forest planting in sections of China? Like masses of forest. It's completely changed rainfall patterns to the point where most of their arable farming land is actually no longer getting sufficient rain because it's all moved to the Tibetan Plateau because of the impact of the forest growth elsewhere in China. And
That
I
is
think
that
that
is
kind of
a lovely
demonstrates
example.
and ties into what you're
Yeah,
saying about those in that chapter about those unknown ecological unknowns, is that we think forest planting, that's a really good thing, but it's completely changed weather cycles and led to reduced rainfall in areas of high population and high farming land where they need more rain.
that is a brilliant example. That is actually, yeah, it's perfect, really, isn't it? And it's a good thing. Planting trees, as you say, it's a good thing.
Ruth, you didn't you kind of got me to share my chapter, but you haven't shared a chapter that really stood out for you.
So I think one of the things to kind of stress again about the edited collection as a whole was the way in which we wanted it to be interdisciplinary and to kind of break out of the normal siloed discussion that is global governance within a kind of very specific law dialogue and debate. And so one of the chapters that stands out for me for that kind of methodological challenge that we wanted the book to speak to is actually the comparative law and global governance chapter written by Christina Fassone and Irene Spigno. And that's because one of the questions that had driven inquiries behind this research handbook right at the beginning was that idea of what was meant by global. And as global constitutionalists, Aoife and I kind of sat there often being like, well, it can be, or we find ourselves at the start of every global constitutionalism chapter being like, it could be the processes within international law, or it could be that comparative constitutional law scholarship that is also seeking to identify unification and diversification in and across the world in global constitutions. And so we'd had this workshop, Aoife, Professor Shoshana Wheatle, on interrogating this idea of global and comparative, and what could comparative constitutional work, what could comparative law methodologies tell us about global and the meaning of global and doing global scholarship. And so we were kind of keen to include and unpack those disciplinary definitional questions, if you like, about what we all meant by global and what were our methods and our toolkits for doing global scholarship. And it raised questions about how different subdisciplines and indeed different disciplines then approached those questions of global governance differently. And so I think what stands out to me in this chapter by Christine and Irene is that they take that and they explore and expand the ways in which we can learn from comparative constitutional law methodologies. We can think about the ways in which their toolkits are very different to the toolkits of international lawyers in terms of what kind of different types of cases, different institutions, different ways in which they ask questions of that case law, from the way in which international lawyers might approach that to piece together ideas of doing and reading about and interrogating global governance scholarship. So it stands out to me as one of many chapters within the edited collection that is trying to do that that methodological work that we wanted the edited collection to do as well, whether or not that was sub-disciplines within our own legal field or new disciplines that we were bringing into conversation with law.
Or from previous conversations you and I have had, genres within study.
Exactly. And talking of genre, I think Aoife's already mentioned, who knew an edited collection on global governance needed more than one reference to a sci-fi series? Because Liam McKagan's chapter starts off with Battleship Galactica. Like it's this fantastic chapter as well that
I'm in the middle of writing a chapter on Battlestar Galactica entitled "When Toasters Commit Genocide," and
brilliant.
I'm just waiting on my co-author to get me her bit so I can finish it off.
Send it on. I want to read that.
Yeah. Lee is a literary scholar, and fascinating way in which how does the literature not talk about global literature or not talk about global history, but talk about global governance. And it's this fascinating chapter that has discussions on Mansfield Park and the Heart of Darkness, and then thinks about stories of resistance and neo-imperial futures, looking at Afrofuturism, indigenous futurisms. A kind of brilliant, again, moment in the book where we reach out and diversify the types of disciplines that make up the cloud of global governance,
And we get people from war studies and geography and literature and and also active people who are in the policy sector and activists and stuff like that, like Paulo, and that it was like trying to get kind of a different ways of seeing, different ways of speaking, language, and what because I think we all know like doing interdisciplinary work, often the issue is the language and the jargon that we use in talking to each other, and but actually that was more that wasn't as scary as it sounds. Actually, getting one with people working together, I don't think we came across anybody having a falling out about the sort of it was more dialogue, that one where we could get people to, and Ruth, your chapter did Cavi's, and I would you describe yourself as an IR scholar? I would give
international relations. I mean, shout out to Cavi. He had to deal with me at the dead end of my PhD, where if anybody mentioned the word global democracy, I was going to scream. And here we were writing a chapter on global democracy. So that was.
I think he would have had the first chapter done, actually. So are you actually the ones waiting the longest?
I'm sure. I'm sure. I'm sure.
I think I was one of the last with Pavarthi. I think Pavarthi were one of the last. So
it was a journey.
A voyage.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to move to wrapping up, and in wrapping up, we normally ask a non-international law question about escape routes and what you're reading and listening to or doing takes your mind off international law. However, because no one has decided on a season 3 question before we've recorded this, I'm exercising my discretion as host to ask one I want to know the answer to. And that is, what is your ultimate comfort food? Where do you get the best version of it? And where can our listeners find a good recipe for it?
I'm going to go first. And it's a very Irish thing because it involves potatoes. But it's a crisp sandwich, but made very specifically with Tayto crisps. Now, going back to the interesting sovereignties of Northern Ireland, there is 2 kinds of Taytos on the island. There's Northern Ireland Tayto and what people in Northern Ireland call Free Stato, which is the original name for Ireland. It was the Irish Free State, they start Ireland. So Free Stato and Northern Ireland Tayto. And they are different. We do taste tests, and I'm going to say Free Stato is the best crisp to use for making a crisp sandwich. I'm going to say the cheese and onion, the best. I make a lot of bread, but it has to be what we refer to in my family as plastic bread. So it can't be like homemade, none of your sourdough. No fancy San Francisco, no rye bread, no black bread, none of this. Now, there are, of course, within that different gradations of sliced pan. And I would say Lynch's from Macroom and Cork has a particularly good, their thick cut sliced pan, which is at the higher end of plastic bread, I'm saying, quality plastic bread. Lots of butter, salted butter, real butter. Kerrygold, I'm going to say, is the ultimate. It's got very fashionable around the world now, but like as
I
all Irish
used to get
produce should
that
be.
butter in Manhattan, so it's good butter. I
Yeah,
know it.
it's very good, good. Right level salt, and very important, most satisfying part of it, alongside eating it, is the moment of the crunch down when you've put all the crisps, the two slices of bread, you crunch it down. It's just, oh, it's a beautiful moment. But that is absolutely my comfort food. I very rarely have plastic bread in the house, but when it is, I'm like, I can make a crisp sandwich. So yeah, my that's definitely, yeah,
And so
it's
what you're saying is the best place to get that is at your house, and
yes,
the recipe you have provided on the podcast. Done.
yeah. So it's all there.
Cher, do you want to go next?
Oh yeah, by the way, thank you, Tamsin. This is a great question. I love it. And then thank you, Eva, for sharing your beautiful recipe there. So my ultimate comfort food is noodles with tomato and egg sauce. So it's a really classic Chinese home style dish made with just three everyday ingredients: noodles, tomatoes, and eggs. It's one of those meals that I grew up with, and so it's incredibly comforting. For me, it feels like home. And the best version is honestly the one you made for yourself, and or the one your family makes for you, because it's all about that kind of a familiar balance of savory, slightly sweet tomatoes and soft eggs. And the good news is it's very easy to cook, very, very easy, I promise you, even if you are not very confident in the kitchen. And if listeners want to try it, I mean, there's a great straightforward recipe online by paper here. And I think if you actually Google it, you will find a lot of recipes. But I myself enjoy more with, I mean, soup, a little bit soup there. And so it's definitely something you can make on a weeknight when you want something warm, something grounding, something nourishing. So noodles with egg and tomato, my favorite.
Um,
Fantastic. Is there a particular type of noodles that you use?
Not really. I tried different noodles and they're all good. Yeah, so yeah, I would say just go for it, and a little bit you can make it a little bit salty if you want it, but I mean the just tomato itself will give you that kind of a flavor. Yeah.
Sounds delicious, Cher. I went for my ultimate comfort food. I focused in on the idea of comfort. So last year, I was lucky enough to go to Franca in Sao Paulo in Brazil to teach. And good food, sharing food, talking about good food for Brazilians is really, really important. And it was a really comforting moment at the end of the teaching where we all went together for our last shared meal. And after much discussion and translation of the menu, I'd ordered the Brazilian stroganoff. And Brazilian stroganoff is different to Russian stroganoff. Difference being that it is creamy tomato-based sauce, and also that you serve it with, I think maybe crisps is a theme here, Aoife, but you serve it with potato sticks. Um, so you have rice, but then you have these little potato chips, potato sticks that you serve it with as well. And it was just delicious. And in that moment, it was incredibly comforting to be kind of surrounded by my peers and my friends. And in terms of the best place to have it is obviously in Franca in Sao Paulo, but the best recipe, my co-author Thais Brunyaretto sent me the best recipe. And so when I make it now for my family, it reminds me of all my friends over there in Brazil. And I think that's why it's probably my ultimate comfort food.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That is all we have time for.
Hang
So,
on a second, Tamsin. Surely you need to share your ultimate comfort
okay,
food.
fine, fine. So, um, my ultimate comfort food is it's actually Chinese, and it's pork and chive dumplings. pan fried. It's got to be pan fried. They've got to be with a blend of um, soy and vinegar. I prefer chili jam to chili oil, but but I can have it with chili oil if I can't get chili jam. Um, the best version of this I have ever found. There's two answers to this. There's this little hole in the wall dumpling cafe that at least used to be, it might not still be there, in Chinatown in Sydney near UTS Law School where I did my undergrad. That we just go and order plates of dumplings for lunch, and it was amazing, and it was how I survived law school. But there's also I found this little just dumpling place in Guangzhou Airport on my way back to New York one time, and the dumplings were amazing.
Oh,
Just sitting in the airport on a like 12-hour layover, jet lagged because I've flown from Manhattan to Melbourne for 2 days at a workshop and then was flying back. I didn't know what time zone I was in. I was exhausted. Nothing, I just had dumplings in this little airport dumpling and noodle bar in China, and it was perfect. In terms of the recipe, I have a recipe kind of in my head from when I used to make them with a very good friend of mine's wife who's from Shanghai. She and I would often make them together. So I have this recipe in my head, but I couldn't tell you where I got it from because it's kind of her mum's recipe and those sorts of things. So but I'm certain that every, Chinese family will be able to give you a good dumpling recipe or show you how to make a good dumpling recipe.
This is a
So
very delicious menu.
yes, and if
Yeah.
we're going for a sweet food, it's a very classic light Frenchy Victoria sponge. So French chefs, not
Ooh.
English chefs, but Victoria sponge. And the best place to get it is my kitchen. And if you need a recipe, email me because,
Ooh,
I did
that would.
a decade as a French trained pastry chef for a reason.
Yeah, hence the comment there about non-English. So.
Yeah.
which one?
Yeah. Well, then apparently now that was all we have time for, and we hope you all enjoyed this episode. Till next time. Bye bye.
Thanks,
Thank
Tamsin.
you, Hudson. Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.